The idea that the king was an enemy of the revolution and sought foreign aid had more effect on the French people than any document or pamphlet. It was a gut punch to the French people. They felt betrayed by their king. The revolutionaries now understood that war would be necessary and that this king, and perhaps any king who might follow him, would have to be removed completely from the arena altogether. Meanwhile, leaders of the other nations of Europe saw the cataclysm in France as a virus that could easily infect their own nations and threaten their own absolutist positions, began to take steps to either contain the revolution or stamp it out completely. However, as the revolution entered its most radical phase, it began to turn on itself, as leaders arose that sought to purify the revolution by disposing of those deemed not revolutionary enough, not radical enough, not ideological enough. What resulted from this was an 11-month period of massacre that would emerge with the revolution having forged a new republic in France and given an identity through one of the greatest hymns ever composed. The key figures who thought it was their duty to stamp out the revolution were Marie Antoinette's brother, Leopold II, the Emperor of Austria who had inherited the throne when his brother Joseph had died, and Frederick William II, the King of Prussia. In consultation with several of the French exiles, the two Germanic rulers issued what was known as the Declaration of Pillnitz in 1792. It was named for the castle in the ancient city of Dresden, which we will focus on a little later in this course. This is where the declaration was issued. It called for France to restore the king to full power, or else. In truth, the declaration was only for show and for the benefit of the French exiles. It stated that Austria would go to war if, and only if, all the other major European powers also went to war with France. Leopold chose this wording so that he would not be forced to go to war. He knew that the British did not want war with France, and the British were the financial backers of Prussia and Austria in this endeavor if it came to be. However, the people of France and the National Assembly saw this as war being imminent, and they forced Louis to declare war on both Austria and Prussia. The French army, which was disorganized because of the revolution, suffered a disastrous defeat in Flanders. They fled at the first sign of battle and even murdered one of their generals, Theobald de Dillon. He was an Irishman, that is, he was one of the wild geese. Now a Prussian army assembled on the Rhine in July of 1792. Under the command of Charles William Ferdinand, the Duke of Brunswick and the brother-in-law of King George III, the Prussians invaded France. They took the fortress city of Verdun, a name that again will become very important later in this course. The Duke then issued his own declaration, calling it the Brunswick Manifesto. This was written with the help of the king's cousin, the Prince Condé. Prince Condé was the grandson of Louis XIV and Madame de Montespan, remember her. The Brunswick Manifesto intended to restore the king to full and absolute power and quell the revolutionary spirit. Instead, it led many to believe that the king was once and for all in bed with the Austrians and the Prussians. A mob assembled in Paris, marched on the Tuileries Palace on August the 10th, burned the palace, and it forced Louis to take shelter with the Legislative Assembly. Austria and Prussia now invaded France. On the left, you see the burning of the Tuileries Palace. On the right, you see the mob of women coming for Marie Antoinette. She would be saved from this mob and would take shelter with the king. And once again, this brought the king and Marie Antoinette closer together, more affection for each other. This is the Tuileries Palace that you see in the picture. It would remain all the way until about 1860. And then finally, it would be torn down and it would be made way for a garden. To the left of the Tuileries Palace here is actually the Louvre. The end of the king came about because the people of France had decided that they had had enough of monarchies and they had had enough of Louis XVI. Gathering together in several political clubs or organizations, they would bring about the deposition of Louis XVI and then his execution. The first of these groups were the provisional members of the French Revolution, that is, the foot soldiers of the French Revolution. They're called the sans-culottes, which literally means without breeches. Culottes are knee-length breeches, often worn by women today. It referred to their lower class status, in which they wore full-length pants or trousers. They were artisans and laborers. It is they who burned the Tuileries Palace and were responsible for many of the executions in the early part of the Revolution. The sans-culottes advocated social equality, economic equality, popular democracy. They supported the abolition of all the authority and privileges of the monarchy, nobility, and Roman Catholic clergy. The establishment of fixed wages, the implementation of price controls to ensure affordable food and other essentials, and always vigilance against counter-revolutionaries. Many who wanted to avoid being called a counter-revolutionary and escape violence often stopped wearing these knee-length breeches that we often see on people like George Washington and many of the American elites. They instead wore trousers. Fashion, or the lack of it, is often the loudest form of political affiliation. The second group formed later in the Revolution and were the ones who essentially gave organization to the violence of the Revolution, were known as the Jacobins. What are the Jacobins? The Jacobins were the largest and most radical of the revolutionary clubs. They got their name from their first meeting at a Dominican monastery, and Dominicans in France were called Jacobins. They were left-wingers and closely allied with the sans-culottes. They advocated strong central government and a regulated economy. Today, when you call someone a Jacobin, it means you're calling them a radical, and usually to the left of center. Now, eventually, the Jacobins themselves split into two groups. The first was called the Girondins, which was the larger but more loosely organized wing of the Jacobin Party. Their name came from the province department in Gironde, in which they began, and they were considered in favor of war and spreading the revolutionary principles through war. Now, one of their more notable members was Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense. The smaller but tighter and more organized group were called the Montagnards, or the Mountain, because they originally sat near the top of the clubs. In the hall, you didn't sit on the floor, you sat sort of in amphitheater style. They represented the middle class. They represented the people of Paris. They felt that whatever was good for Paris was good for the rest of France. In this, they were sometimes mistaken. They are the ones who advocated the execution of the king. It is the Jacobins that bring about the end of the monarchy. They abolished property qualifications to vote and hold office. They advocated universal male suffrage and enacted it. They then arrested Louis XVI. They placed him in the Temple prison. He was then deposed as king and renamed Citoyen Louis Capet. Supposedly, Capet was the name of the Bourbon dynasty, the Capetian dynasty. They then put him on trial for treason. On the left is a sans-culotte carrying the French tricolor, and on the right is a Jacobin club. The royal family under arrest. In the upper left, Marie Antoinette under constant guard in her cell in the Temple prison. On the right, the now deposed Louis Capet, no longer referred to as Louis XVI, awaiting his trial and eventual execution. Marie Antoinette was subjected to a lengthy number of indignities, not the least of which is that she was under constant guard and had no privacy in her cell. This is the Conciergerie Museum, and it reconstitutes the guard behind a partition and Marie Antoinette sitting at her desk in prayer, no doubt. The execution of Louis XVI came from the belief that his continued existence itself was a threat to the revolution. Louis's rejection of Girondin ministers in the government had forged the Girondins into league with the Mountain against Louis. Louis was already resigned to his fate when he went on trial. He told his attorneys, do your best, but the outcome has already been determined. The reason that he felt this way is that his iron chest at the Tuileries was opened, and it was discovered that he had had dealings with counter-revolutionaries. He was found guilty. The Girondins throughout the trial argued for clemency or exile. The Mountain, on the other hand, argued for execution. We cannot allow this man to have any chance to come back. We need to execute him. The vote was taken. Louis was sentenced to death by one vote. One of the votes for execution was the king's own cousin, the Duke of Orleans, who would later be beheaded himself that year. The Duke favored a constitutional monarchy, and he favored himself on the throne. The trial concluded by saying the king had betrayed France and her people by fleeing the country. Secondly, by the simple nature of his being king, by the accident of his birth, Louis was a threat to France. Louis took his sentence very quietly and very calmly. He had plenty of visitors and then stopped taking visitors because he said, I need to concentrate on not breaking down and crying before I go to my death. On January 21st, 1793, 38-year-old Louis Capet, formerly Louis XVI, mounted the rostrum in the Place de la Concorde, temporarily renamed the Place de la Révolution. He went to his fate with dignity. He briefly declared his innocence, forgave those who had voted for his execution, and prayed that his blood would not stain all of France. At this point, the conductor of the proceedings ordered the band to start playing to drown out anything else he might say. He was lowered into place. The blade fell. The king was beheaded. The cannons boomed. The crowd either cheered or had a gasp. Louis's body was then buried in a field with other counter-revolutionaries. His head was placed between his knees. Later, Louis's brother, Louis XVIII, disinterred the body and buried him and later his wife, Marie Antoinette, in the chapel of the Cathedral of Saint-Denis in northern Paris. The king was dead. That is the Place de la Concorde, renamed the Place de la Révolution. You notice the Egyptian obelisk in the center of it. That was brought back to Paris by Napoleon later, but it does mark the spot where the guillotine fell on Louis XVI, as well as on several hundred other people throughout the Revolution. This is the view of the Place de la Concorde from the top of, you guessed it, the Eiffel Tower. And that is the Seine River in the foreground. This is the memorial to Louis XVI and his Queen Marie Antoinette in the Basilica of Saint Denis. The young Dauphin of France, Louis Charles, Duke of Normandy, would have been the heir to the throne. His older brother died at the age of 5. Louis Charles died of tuberculosis at age 10 while in the Temple prison in 1795. It was apparent that he had suffered numerous beatings while in prison from his captors. Upon his death, his heart was removed according to custom, and then it was smuggled out of the prison. It is now next to his parents at their tombs. This is the Tuileries Garden in Paris, which is right next to the Louvre. The palace was burned and then demolished in 1871. And this is another view of the Tuileries Garden looking toward the Louvre itself. And you can tell it's the Louvre because of that incredibly ugly pyramid glass structure that they decided to put in front of it. As with Charles I of England 150 years earlier, the execution of a monarch marks the point of no return. If one can execute a monarch, no one is safe. The revolution now turns on itself. It became more and more radical. The revolutionaries begin to sense that those who advocated clemency for the king were enemies of the revolution. The Montagnards, who advocated the execution of the king, were now assisted by their provisional forces, the Sans-Culottes. They purged the Girondins from the National Assembly. With this, they now call themselves the National Convention. It abandoned the monarchy altogether and elected its members by universal male suffrage. It also established paramilitary revolutionary armies, and it empowered revolutionary courts to try supposed traitors. What happened, though, is that it became a place for people to redress their grievances or to take out grievances on others, and things begin to get out of hand. The convention then concentrated most of the executive power into the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety, which acted as the virtual dictator of France, oversaw food distribution, the conduct of the war, and rooting out counter-revolutionaries. The problem was eventually the Committee of Public Safety disregarded the first two in favor of the third. Georges Jacques Danton, first president of the Committee of Public Safety, was later arrested for leniency and moderation, and with his arrest began a period of great fear and anxiety through France. The removal of Danton marked the rising of the other great leader of the Committee of Public Safety during the Revolution, this man right here. Known as the Incorruptible One, Maximilien Robespierre was a country lawyer from Arras, France. He was a disciple of Rousseau and Montesquieu as well. Robespierre admired the ideal of the old Roman Republic and was an advocate for citizens who previously had no political voice. He was a pure idealist and an ideologue through and through, but he was also something of a sociopath, because he pursued his goals with little regard for whom it hurt on an individual basis, and that would be his undoing. Robespierre rose to become leader of the Montagnards, and he was a chief advocate for the execution of Louis XVI. With the removal of Danton, he takes control of the Committee for Public Safety. Robespierre believed almost fanatically in what was called a Republic of Virtue. The Republic of Virtue idealized democracy, but restricted liberties when necessary. It favored a free market, but enacted price controls to quell discontent in the streets. The Republic of Virtue believed that virtue was impotent without terror. You needed to have a threat to be virtuous. If the basis of popular government in peacetime is virtue, he wrote, the basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue without terror is baneful terror, without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing more than speedy, severe, and inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy, applied to the most pressing needs of the patrie, that is, the homeland. At a meeting of the National Convention on September the 5th, 1793, Bertrand Barrère rose and exclaimed, "Let's make terror the order of the day." And it would be Robespierre who initiated the 10-month period known as the Reign of Terror. I mean, that whole sound just sounds doom and ominous. The whole idea of the terror was to weed out counter-revolutionaries, inspire the French nation and military to rally against foreign threats, and yield to popular pressure against the clergy and aristocracy. This 10-month period featured public executions and massacres accompanying accusations of treason by the Committee for Public Safety. All sides became more and more radicalized, and large-scale violence broke out in the streets and featured numerous executions. The chief object of the terror is what you see in the picture right there, the guillotine. It was developed by Dr. Joseph Guillotin, so it bears his name. The guillotine symbolized the tyranny of the revolution and the end of the power of the nobles. However, the guillotine marks the first true equal application of capital punishment. Using a weight and a beveled blade, it made a swift and sure cut of the neck, separating the head from the body. And both noble and common person and peasant all together received the same justice. The guillotine would be featured as an instrument of French execution all the way up into the 1900s. With the guillotine, Danton, Olympe de Gouges, the feminist leader of the revolution, would be guillotined. Marie Antoinette was executed after a sham trial with a guillotine. They brought in all sorts of libelous testimony against her. She was subjected to all sorts of accusations which were not true. With the guillotine, 40,000 people were executed, with a further 300,000 suffered imprisonment and feared the guillotine as their ultimate fate. It always takes a real military victory to confirm a government, and after the surprising victory of the French army against the Prussians at Valmy, the National Convention declared the First Republic of France. Now, in France's history, there have been 5 republics. This was the first. The last one is the one that Emmanuel Macron is in charge of today. France begins to reorganize society and culture under the National Convention. It mandates state-run compulsory education. It even puts together a new revolutionary calendar. It saw the measurements of the world all out of whack and tried to put everything on a 10-point system. And so the names of the months were changed. For instance, late October to late November was called Brumaire, which means mist, autumn mist. Thermidor, or hot, was the end of July to the end of August. Frenchmen and Frenchwomen were addressed as citoyen and citoyenne. Now, many of these changes do not last past 1805, but the metric system becomes the measurement system everywhere, except, of course, in the United States. The revolution also begins to adopt symbols. The figure of liberty becomes a symbol of the revolution. It's one of the reasons why France will gift that lady statue to us in 1876. The French tricolore becomes the national flag of France. colors of the flag themselves no longer represent the King, Saint Denis, and Saint Martin. Instead, they represent liberty, equality, and fraternity. The revolution has revolutionary festivals. I talk about civic religion. Bastille Day, July the 14th, which is coming up. The day of the storming of the Bastille. That is a French national holiday, even to this day. Robespierre even tries to overthrow religion in France and replace it with what is known as the cult of the supreme being. Notre Dame, which is now undergoing repair after that awful fire some years ago, was turned into the Temple of Reason. And this is where people throughout France started looking at Robespierre with a, "Are you serious?" attitude, or, "Hey, Robespierre, get over yourself a little bit," because Robespierre was getting rather messianic in his proclamations. There is nothing, of course, that brings a nation together like an anthem. The American national anthem is actually based upon a drinking song that the pubs of London specialized in the 1700s, and yet it's our most sacred hymn today. The French national anthem, the Hymn of Hymns, was written by Claude Joseph Rouget de Lisle on April the 25th, 1792 in Strasbourg, in Alsace, near the German border. De Lisle was not a Catholic. He was a Freemason, but he was an ardent French nationalist and did not like the fact that the Prussians were standing on French soil. He wanted to rally the French army after the Prussians had invaded. He titled his song Chant de guerre pour l'armée du Rhin, or War Song of the Rhine Army. The hymn was in the style of a European march, it's anthemic style. It became the rallying cry of the revolution. When it was first played in the convention, a young artillery officer from Corsica said, "Now that is a hymn that will bring all of France together." His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. The convention adopted it as their national anthem on the 6th anniversary of Bastille Day. It gets its name, La Marseillaise, because it was sung by volunteers from Marseille, the great city in southern France, who were patrolling the streets of Paris. Notice, if you will, how the lyrics go. And when you hear this song, as you will on the next slide, you leave the room after hearing that song with the idea that you want to go out and beat the living hell out of someone.